May 8th, 1945. London woke to something it hadn't felt in 5 years, 8 months and 5 days. Not quite peace yet. That wouldn't be official until 1 minute past 11 that night, but the certainty of it. The German war was over. Everyone knew it, even before Winston Churchill told them so. The morning papers had already printed the news, though the formal announcement had been delayed. People poured into the streets anyway, not waiting for official permission to celebrate. They'd been waiting since Monday, when German forces in Northern Europe had surrendered, when the wireless had crackled with rumors that the end was coming any hour now. Tuesday had passed in agonizing anticipation. Now, Wednesday morning, the waiting was unbearable. In homes across Britain, families gathered around wireless sets, the same sets they'd huddled beside through 5 years of war news, through the darkness of 1940, through the grinding years that followed. They'd heard Churchill's voice come through those speakers dozens of times, rallying them, warning them, promising them nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Today, they would hear something different. At 10 Downing Street, Churchill prepared for his 3 o'clock broadcast. He was 70 years old, exhausted from years of wartime leadership, his body bearing the weight of decisions that had cost hundreds of thousands of British lives, 383,000 military dead, 67,000 civilians killed in the bombing. Numbers that had accumulated across those 5 years, 8 months and 5 days, each one a name, a family, a future that would never happen. He had written and rewritten his speech, choosing each word carefully. This wasn't a moment for soaring rhetoric or dramatic flourishes. The facts would speak for themselves. The German High Command had signed the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was finished. That was enough. The morning passed in a strange suspension. Shops closed early, or didn't open at all. Offices emptied as workers left their desks and walked toward Trafalgar Square, toward Piccadilly Circus, toward Buckingham Palace, drawn by the collective need to be together, to see other faces feeling what they felt. The streets filled with people wearing red, white, and blue. Ribbons, hats, scarves, anything they could find. Some had saved these colors for years, hidden away, waiting for this day. Church bells rang. That sound alone was extraordinary. The bells had been silenced since 1940, reserved as a warning signal for invasion. For 5 years, the only time church bells would ring was if German forces landed on British soil. Now they rang in celebration, the sound cascading across cities and villages, each peal announcing what words couldn't quite capture. At 3 o'clock precisely, Churchill sat in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. The BBC microphones were ready. Millions of people across Britain, across the Commonwealth, across the Allied world, waited to hear him. He began to speak, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly weight, but with something lighter in it now, something that hadn't been there before. Yesterday morning at 41 minutes past 2 at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. The words were precise, formal, laying out the facts. No embellishment needed. The thing itself was enormous enough. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Churchill continued. But in the interests of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded all along the front, and our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today. The Channel Islands, British soil that had been under German occupation since 1940. 5 years of enemy control, 5 years of waiting. Today, freedom would return. The German war is therefore at an end. 5 words. The simplest possible statement. After everything, after Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, after the Blitz and the Atlantic convoys, after North Africa and Italy and Normandy, after the years of rationing and bombing and loss. It came down to 5 words. The German war is therefore at an end. But Churchill didn't let the moment rest there. He knew what people were feeling, knew the relief and joy flooding through every home, every street. He also knew what lay ahead. He said, even in victory, a warning. The war wasn't over, not completely. British forces were still fighting in Burma, still dying in the Pacific. The celebration had to be measured, tempered by the knowledge that more sacrifice was coming. Churchill's voice strengthened as he moved toward his conclusion, the old fire returning. Quote, the broadcast ended. Across Britain, people sat for a moment in silence, absorbing what they'd heard. Then they stood and walked outside, joining the crowds that were already singing, dancing, embracing strangers. The celebration that had been building all morning broke open completely. In London, over 1 million people filled the streets. Trafalgar Square became a sea of bodies, people climbing onto Nelson's column, onto lampposts, onto the stone lions, waving flags and cheering. Piccadilly Circus was impassable, every inch of pavement covered with celebrating crowds. Outside Buckingham Palace, thousands gathered, calling for the King and Queen, who appeared on the balcony again and again throughout the day, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret beside them. The blackout was over. For the first time in 5 years, lights could burn freely after dark. People lit bonfires in the streets, the flames climbing high, visible for miles. Effigies of Hitler burned in those fires, the cardboard and cloth figures consumed while crowds cheered. Searchlights that had swept the sky looking for enemy bombers now played across the clouds in celebration, their beams crossing and recrossing in patterns of pure joy. Floodlights illuminated public buildings for the first time since 1939. The Houses of Parliament glowed golden against the night sky. St. Paul's Cathedral, which had survived the Blitz, stood lit and magnificent. People who had spent years navigating London's darkness by memory and dim torchlight now saw their city revealed, beautiful and battered and still standing. The pubs opened their doors and ran out of beer within hours. It didn't matter. People danced in the streets without alcohol, fueled by relief and exhaustion and the sheer, overwhelming fact of survival. Strangers kissed. Service members in uniform were mobbed with affection. Women who had spent years working in factories, who had driven ambulances through bombing raids, who had kept the country running while the men fought, now danced with those men, with each other, with anyone nearby. Music poured from open windows, gramophones playing swing and jazz, people singing patriotic songs, Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory, mixing with We'll Meet Again and The White Cliffs of Dover. The songs that had sustained them through the war years now became victory anthems, but Churchill wasn't finished. As evening fell, he left 10 Downing Street and walked the short distance to Whitehall, where massive crowds had gathered outside the Ministry of Health building. They'd been calling for him all afternoon, wanting to see him, to thank him, to share this moment with the man whose voice had guided them through the darkest years. He appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, looking down at the sea of faces below. The crowd roared. Churchill raised his hand in his famous V for Victory sign, the gesture he'd made throughout the war, the symbol that had come to represent British defiance and determination. Quote, 11. He called out to them. Quote, "Toi pomme." The crowd wouldn't accept that. Voices rose from thousands of throats. No, it is yours. Churchill shook his head, his eyes wet with tears. It is the victory of the cause of freedom in every land. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Everyone, man or woman, has done their best. Everyone has tried. Neither the long years, nor the dangers, nor the fierce attacks of the enemy have in any way weakened the independent resolve of the British nation. God bless you all." The cheering was deafening. Churchill stood there, looking down at them, these people who had endured so much. They had lived through the terror of 1940, when invasion seemed certain, when German bombers came night after night, when the future looked impossibly dark. They had endured the rationing, the shortages, the constant low-level hardship of wartime existence. They had sent their sons and husbands and fathers to fight, and too many of those men hadn't come home. They had worked in factories and farms, had served as air raid wardens and fire watchers, had kept the country functioning through everything Germany could throw at them. And they had survived. They had won. Not easily, not cheaply, but completely. The German war was over. But even as Churchill stood on that balcony, even as he absorbed the love and gratitude pouring up from the crowd, his mind was already moving forward. He was thinking about the Soviet Union, about the Red Army now occupying half of Europe, about Stalin's intentions and the new threats emerging even as the old one died. He was thinking about Japan, about the fighting still raging in the Pacific, about British forces still in combat. He was thinking about the election that would come soon, about the political battles ahead. The crowd below him knew none of this. For them, this night was pure celebration. Pure relief. They had earned that. They deserved this moment of uncomplicated joy. The party continued through the night. Bonfires burned until dawn. Dancing went on until people collapsed from exhaustion. The lights stayed on, blazing defiantly after years of darkness. London glowed like a beacon, visible from miles away, announcing to anyone who could see that Britain had survived, had endured, had won. In quieter corners, away from the crowds, other scenes played out. Families gathered in living rooms, looking at photographs of sons and fathers who wouldn't be coming home, whose sacrifice had purchased this victory. Women sat alone, holding letters, remembering voices they wouldn't hear again. The price of victory was visible in these private moments, in the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the children who would grow up without fathers. Churchill understood this. His speeches had always acknowledged the cost, had never pretended that victory would come easily or cheaply. When he had promised nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, he had meant it literally. Britain had paid in all four, but Britain had also survived. That was the miracle of it, the thing that seemed impossible in 1940, when German armies swept across Europe, when the Luftwaffe filled British skies, when invasion barges gathered across the Channel. Britain had stood alone then, had refused to surrender, had fought on when every rational calculation said to quit. Churchill's voice on the wireless had told them they could endure, that they would endure, and somehow they had. The 3 o'clock broadcast became the defining moment of the day, the point when official confirmation met popular celebration. Churchill's words were simple, factual, almost understated, exactly what the moment needed. No grand rhetoric could match the simple statement. The German war's therefore at an end. But those words carried the weight of everything that had come before. They carried Dunkirk, where 300,000 British troops had been evacuated from French beaches under German fire. They carried the Battle of Britain, when RAF pilots had fought wave after wave of German bombers through the summer and autumn of 1940. They carried the Blitz, when German bombs had fallen on London for 57 consecutive nights, killing tens of thousands, destroying homes and businesses and churches. They carried the Atlantic convoys, the merchant ships that had run the gauntlet of German U-boats to bring food and supplies to Britain, the sailors who had drowned in the cold waters when torpedoes struck. They carried the Desert War in North Africa, the fighting in Italy, the invasion of Normandy. They carried every battle, every bombing raid, every act of courage and sacrifice that had brought Britain from 1939 to 1945. Churchill's warning about Japan was prescient but largely ignored that day. The crowds celebrating in the streets weren't thinking about the Pacific War. That was distant, abstract, someone else's fight. The war that mattered, the war that had threatened their homes and families directly, was over. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the reality of victory would become more complex. The devastation across Europe would become clear. Cities reduced to rubble, millions of refugees, concentration camps revealing horrors beyond imagination. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe would create new tensions. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August would end the Pacific War, but open a new and terrifying age. But on May 8, 1945, those complications were invisible. On that day, Britain celebrated victory, pure and simple. The German war was over. The bombs would not fall again. The blackout was finished. Life could begin to return to normal, whatever normal would mean in this new world. Churchill's voice had guided them through it all. From his first speech as Prime Minister in May 1940, when he had promised nothing but hardship, to this moment in May 1945, when he could finally announce victory, his words had been the thread connecting British resolve. He had never lied to them, never pretended things were better than they were, never offered false hope. He had told them the truth, that the fight would be long and hard and costly, and then told them they would win anyway. And they had. Against odds that seemed impossible, against an enemy that had conquered most of Europe, Britain had survived and won. The island nation that had stood alone in 1940 now stood victorious in 1945, battered but unbroken, exhausted but triumphant. As midnight approached, as the official end of hostilities drew near, the celebrations reached their peak. At precisely 1 minute past 11, the war in Europe officially ended. 6 years of conflict, 60 million dead worldwide, entire cities destroyed, empires shattered, the world transformed beyond recognition, all of it came to an end at that moment. Churchill's words from the 3 o'clock broadcast echoed in memory. Quote, 15. Simple words for an enormous moment, the kind of plain statement that Churchill had used throughout the war, letting the facts speak for themselves, trusting the British people to understand what was at stake without excessive explanation. That trust had been repaid. The British people had understood perfectly. They had endured everything, sacrificed everything, and now they celebrated everything. The streets of Britain rang with joy that night, with relief and exhaustion and pride and grief all mixed together, all the emotions of 6 years of war released in one explosive moment of celebration. Churchill stood on the Ministry of Health balcony and looked down at them, these people who had followed him through the darkest years of British history, and told them the truth one more time. Quote 16, and it was. It belonged to every person who had lived through those years, who had endured the bombing and the rationing and the fear, who had worked in factories and fought in battles and kept the country running when everything seemed to be falling apart. It belonged to the mothers who had sent their sons to war and the wives who had waited for husbands who didn't come home. It belonged to the pilots who had fought in the skies over Britain and the sailors who had died in the Atlantic and the soldiers who had stormed the beaches at Normandy. It belonged to all of them, and on May 8th, 1945, they claimed it. They danced in the streets and lit bonfires and sang songs and embraced strangers and cried with relief and joy. They celebrated not just victory over Germany, but survival itself, the simple, miraculous fact that they were still here, still British, still free. Churchill's voice on the wireless at 3 o'clock that afternoon had made it official, had given them permission to celebrate what they already knew. The German war was over. Britain had won.